So it is my great pleasure in introducing Marinus van IJzendoorn. He's Professor of Human Development at the Department of Psychology, Education and Child Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Professor van IJzendoorn has a glowing CV with an impressive list of appointments and academic achievements, but most importantly, anyone who delves into the attachment literature will discover that he is a world leader in attachment research and theory. And so we are particularly privileged and honored to have him speak at our webinar today. His title is Institutional Care is Structural Neglect and Deviates from any Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness. So without further ado, over to you, Marinus.
Thank you so much, Riyad, for your kind introduction. Can you hear me?
We can hear and see your slides.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you for organizing this wonderful webinar. It's great to have a chance to talk today about Darwin, about Bowlby, about attachment theory. My focus will be on child maltreatments and on institutional care as a certain kind of child maltreatment, structural neglect, which deviates from any environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. It's work that I'm going to report about, done with a lot of colleagues, PhD students, postdocs, but especially for many, many years with Professor Marian Bakermans-Kranenburg. Now, surely Jeremy Holmes was right in calling Darwin Bowlby's great hero. For sure, his last book was on the new biography of Charles Darwin, a very beautiful description of his life and work. And maybe by chance, I'm also an admirer of Charles Darwin. Here I'm sitting next to him, the bench in Christ College in Cambridge, and I admire him for his empirical research, which is manifold, and his, of course, theoretical work. But also because he was a very courageous person. If you have read The Voyage of the Beagle, then you know what I'm talking about. And he was really human-like. Here is a little note in one of his diaries, and you can't read it, of course, but it's referring to bad hair days that all of us might have sometime. But, it's a quote, "But I'm very poorly today and very stupid, and I hate everybody and everything," is what this quote says. So it was a wonderful person and scientist. Surely Bowlby was inspired by Darwin, but how about his grandchildren in attachment theory? If you look at the trilogy, Bowlby, Attachment, Separation and Loss, you find several pages with citation to Darwin, especially the origin of species, the expression of the emotions, the descent of man. But if you look at patterns of attachment, the famous volume that really started the empirical attachment research, Mary Ainsworth's book, written with PhD students of her, 0, nil, no citations to Darwin's work. And look in the Handbook of Attachment, the 3rd edition, a couple of years ago, what you will find is 1,000 densely printed pages, all about attachment theory and research, and only 12 citations to Darwin. Most of them in J. Belsky's chapter on evolutionary background of attachment, and some of them in my chapter with Avisagi Schwartz about cross-cultural universality of attachment. So maybe Darwin has been marginalized a bit. In the last 5 years, more than 1,000 papers on attachment theory, we find Bowlby and Darwin together in very few cases, only 5 of them. It's really the fringy, that the lower left corner, that Darwin is hidden in this whole, I must say, stratosphere of citations from one to another. Nevertheless, Darwin certainly is Bowlby's greatest source of inspiration in my perspective. I pick and choose only 3 of those sources of inspiration. First of all, Darwin showed the adaptation to be reproduction and promotion of offspring survival in specific niches. Certainly in his revised edition of Attachment, first volume, he is surely aware of inclusive fitness. Second, Darwin's core mechanism of evolutionary development, variation, selection, replication, environment of evolutionary adaptedness, separates Bowlby quite sharply from a Lamarckian Freud. In Separation, there's a small chapter being devoted to this issue. Of course, you might say Lamarck has now experiencing as a kind of a revival, because inheritance of acquired traits seems to come closer and closer because of epigenetic work, considered to be the archive of early adversities for the next generation. But 10 years doing or methylation research, especially within the epigenetic field, made me aware, and there's 2 papers coming out soon, that it's really a very complex field, and I think Lamarck still has to wait a few decades to really be considered a competitor of Charles Darwin in this respect. Last, Darwin traced adults' expression of grief over loss to infant crying to recover missing attachment figures, for example. And that's central to Lost, the last final volume in the trilogy of John Bowlby. Let us look a little bit closer to this infant crying. Crying and laughter are behaviors mediating attachment relationships in the first few years of life, and in fact, across the lifespan, I think. It's an inborn social signal with a predictable outcome of increased proximity of parent to the child, promoting its survival, and I should add its inclusive fitness later on. Charles Darwin wrote about crying in The Expressions of the Emotions. Here, a picture from that book, and one of those pictures is the crying William, his son, that he wrote about in a diary. We were interested in crying because it's this attachment behavior, and in the evolutionary origin of it. Is there really crocodile tears to be observed? Do elephants cry? Yes, maybe they do, but they have this basal cry that's needed for lubrication of dry eyelids. But that might be the root, originally, of the emotional cry that has been called uniquely human. I don't know if someone calls a certain behavior uniquely human. I'm always a little bit skeptic. Maybe something is popping up, a research done in another species that shows that there's also emotional crying in that species. But nevertheless, it's certainly very characteristic of babies. What we looked at in one of our studies on crying was showing cry faces of infants with and without a tear attached to the face, and adults with the same type of cry face and a tear. What we wondered about whether adults, caregivers, or caregivers in the future, made a difference in terms of their neural activation in a reaction to seeing these baby tears and baby cry faces. And what we found was indeed that baby tears trigger more brain activity than adult tears, especially in the precuneus and the inferior frontal gyrus. Those are regions in the brain that speculatively have been projected upon the idea of emotion regulation and especially empathic concern. So certainly infant cry faces and tears are calling for a lot of neural activation. But that's not only a stimulus to elicit care. It's also true that persistent crying in the first few years have been found to trigger abuse. One of the epidemiological studies in the Netherlands by Reineveld showed that already after 9 months after birth, young mothers confessed to have shaken, slapped, or smothered their baby who were persistently crying. So that's really child maltreatment, a very dangerous form of child maltreatment, in fact. We can understand that type of behavior because in the early environments of evolutionary adaptedness, persistent crying might have attracted predators, dangerous animals for the caregivers as well as for the infants. So they should stop their crying behavior after some time. The worldwide prevalent rate of child maltreatment is really impressive, even derived from informant studies that have a lower boundary prevalence rate, 0.4, 0.3, 0.3% for sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Self-report studies show a lot more of that prevalence. Is it really true that child maltreatment experiences cause later health problems? That's what AIDS research, the first childhood experience research, is showing, at least on a correlational level. But is it really a cause? There's no experimental research showing that that's true in the human species. What we did very recently was using Mendelian randomization. And that's, in fact, a kind of an alternative to a randomized control trial. By the way, Mendel was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, read his work very carefully because he annotated it densely, but Darwin, unfortunately, did not know Mendel's work. What we did was have a look at 180,000 participants who provided data on their DNA and reports on childhood maltreatment experiences. And we had information about depression, ADHD, and schizophrenia for mental health. And for physical health, type 2, diabetes, coronary artery disease, and some other indicators of bad health. It's just appeared this week in the Lancet Psychiatry. Now, Mendelian randomization, as an alternative to RCTs, is making use of the random allocation of alleles. And if you have a so-called polygenic score for some kind of exposure, like child maltreatment, then it's possible to divide a large group into two groups, those who had experienced child maltreatment and those who have not. All things else are being equal because these alleles are randomly allocated. There are quite a few crucial assumptions that we tested in this study, but most important is the SNP heritability, single nucleotide polymorphisms, a polygenic score for child maltreatment exposure, determining or at least explaining part of the variance in health outcomes through the mediator of child maltreatment. And what we found was in this study, first of all, that there is a SNP heritability of structural DNA, not a behavior genetic heritability, of experiences of maltreatment. The variance in experience of maltreatment explained for 9% by differences in DNA. And that's to be explained, as we found, by sibling research and the study of autistic children, by gene, by environment correlation. I cannot go into detail, but surely the environment is critical, and by changing the environment, you can change the heritability, in fact, the influence of the heritability on maltreatment, and potentially also its consequences. What we found was that indeed child maltreatment is one of the causes, not only a correlate, concomitant, but a cause of poor mental health, as would be expected on all kinds of correlation studies, but not of physical health. Caveat is that it's all about small part of the causal chain, and the assessment of maltreatment is in these large cohort studies is not optimal. Now, what about a neglected type of maltreatment, structural neglect in institutions? It's having a prevalence that's similar to the other types of abuse. About 7.52 million children still are living in institutional settings in 2015, which was shown by Desmond and his colleagues. Structural neglect, I think, needs to be added to the catalogue of types of child maltreatment. Why is that? Well, this is a look into the daily life in institutions. One of the very few studies that we have been doing with Professor Femi Juffer in orphanages in India. We followed one child per time, 5 hours per child with videotaped spot observation. What we found was a terrible lack of any interaction, any vocalization, caregiver to child or child to caregiver, and almost no interactions of any meaningful kind. It's a very depriving environment with a lot of consequences for child development. And this is what we found. If 0 is the norm for children typically raised in families, -2 means -2 standard deviations below the norm. That's stunted growth, physical growth, for example, weight, height, head circumference is a very crude indicator of brain growth, and IQ. Look at IQ, 2 standard deviations mean going down average from 100 to 70 on the border of mental retardation. That's the effect of institutionalization. Children are bullying each other unmonitored by an overburdened set of caregivers, staff in this type of settings. What we did in a series of meta-analysis, bring together all the studies done after John Bowlby, 65 years, 300 plus studies, more than 100,000 children involved in more than 60 countries to see what the consequences are of institutionalization and of deinstitutionalization, transition of children going into family type of settings. And what we found was really very much of a developmental damage, a dose-response relation with duration of congregate or institutional care for growth, head circumference, cognitive development, and other dimensions of development. Social-emotional development seems to be saved a bit, but if we look more carefully at attachment observed in those institutional settings, we find really a lot of detrimental effects of institutions. Almost 2 times higher percentage of attachment insecurity in those institutions, and almost 4 times higher percentage of atypical disorganized attachments in institutions. Why is it that institutional congregate care is bad for child development? Lots of reasons or causes might be summarized here, but let's focus on caregivers. Is there really a problem with having more than one caregiver in an institutional setting? Attachment theory has been accused of propagating monotropy. The biological mother would be the essential mother figure, attachment figure. To say of a child that he has an attachment to someone means that he is strongly disposed to seek proximity to and contact with a specific figure. To do so in certain situations, notably when he's frightened, tired, or ill. And I think this definition by John Bowlby has created a lot of confusion because of this word a specific figure. It's not one specific figure, it is a specific figure that takes the time to interact with the child during a couple of years, starting from birth. It's not feeding, it's not breastfeeding, it's not biological tie, as adoption research that we did a lot has been showing, and it's not monotropy, because even John Bowlby didn't emphasize monotropy at all. And that would also be having a strange idea, because in the environments of evolutionary adaptedness, monotropy would absolutely not work. That's what, for example, Sarah Hurley is arguing. Humans are cooperative breeders. She counted 13 million calories that it would take to bring a newborn to nutritional independence during the 100,000s of years of evolution of the human species. Allo parents are really needed to share this enormous maternal burden. And densely spaced offspring, like in the human species, requires larger networks. Very important is also Hamilton's rule. Cost of investment in offspring must be lower, is Hamilton's rule, than the benefits weighed to others, to offspring, weighted by the relatedness of that offspring to them, to the parents, for example, or the grandparents. Paternal investment is larger if paternity is sure. That's absolutely not always the case. Mater semper certa est, but not the fathers. Last, high perinatal mortality was the case in evolutionary times, and it would be a waste of inclusive fitness if the mortality of the mother would mean that also the newborn, healthy newborn, would decease. So others would take over the care for the child, the grandparents, the father, uncles and aunts, or other members of the small groups. Parents and infants, that's a basic thesis from attachment theory to be derived from the Darwinian basis. Are evolutionary built for attachment networks. So that's not the problem of congregate care. The problem of congregate care is that it's professional congregate care with a lot of changes of caregivers throughout the stay in an institutional environment. This is what Bowlby says about this evolutionary environment. More the social environment deviates from the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, probably father, mother, siblings, social environment, grandparents, limited number of other known families, the greater will be the risk of his developing maladaptive patterns of social behavior. And that's indeed true for institutions, that they are really deviating from any type of environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. It's a total institution, taking care of sleep, work, play, anything else. It's a classic example of an asylum as labeled by Irving Goffman in the 60s of the last century. Institutions are structurally neglected because of their regimented nature, high child to caregiver ratio, multiple shifts because 24/7 care is needed, high staff turnover because it's overburdened caregivers, and lowly paid and low respected, and frequent change of caregivers. What we found in our studies was in many cases 40 different caregivers that had been experienced by toddlers in the first 2 or 3 years to stay in an institution. Children become stunted, mentally delayed, and emotionally disturbed in that kind of environment. And moreover, if they have vulnerabilities, for example, handicapped children, are at an increased risk of physical and sexual abuse that we found in one of our epidemiological studies in the Netherlands. Intellectual disabilities lead to, in institutional settings, to a lot more sexual abuse than in foster families. And mild intellectual disability also creates more violent environments compared to regular residential care. So these total institutions are really violent and bad for development. The question then rises, why in fact do orphanages and congregate care exist at all if they are outside of these environments of evolutionary adaptiveness? My hypothesis is that orphanages are surrogate infanticide. We know that infanticide was occurring in rather high rates throughout evolution. For example, due to extreme lack of social and physical resources. Shepa Hughes showed in her cultural anthropology book on Brazil in a beautiful way how that works. Due to struggle for dominance within or between groups, Sarah Hurdy, the Langur, showed that to happen. And due to perceived constitutional disabilities that Martin de Vries showed to exist in one of the famines in Africa, in which the lethargic children were left alone and starved from that. So if the costs for taking care of children, of offspring, are much larger than the benefit weighted by the relatedness of the offspring to the one who is providing care, then infanticide might be the consequence. Unintended by the participants, by the parents, caregivers, but sometimes also culturally made acceptable. That's what Shepa Hughes, for example, showed, that there are religious symbols to manage to make this not infanticide, but a benign transition to heaven. But if abandonment lowers the cost of infanticide and even slightly elevates the chance of benefit by survival of the offspring, orphanages would be a plausible alternative from the perspective of gene-culture coevolution. And some 1,000 years ago, indeed, foundling wheels were decreed by Pope Innocent III to decrease the number of babies drowned in the Tiber. And baby hatches still exist, 100 of them, for example, in Germany. And these babies, foundlings, were transited to orphanages, institutional care, and might have the chance to transit to family environments. And if that would be the case, then they would be very lucky because they would show to be very resilient. We found in our set of meta-analysis that the transition to family type of care is amazingly effective as an intervention. Fast recovery in all kinds of areas of development, in kinship, foster, kafala, or adoptive care. Certainly in physical growth, but also in development of cognition. And it's not due to pre-existing differences between the children who are going into an institution and those who are not going in there. A randomized controlled trial, the one and only, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project showed that these pre-existing differences don't exist in their study, and that nevertheless fostered children are much better off. And there's a big convergence, a great convergence between the meta-analytic findings and these findings of the randomized control study by Fox, Nelson, and Zena. I would like to spend one slide to COVID-19, in the midst of which we are now trying to function, and what it has in terms of impact on institutionalization. More morbidity is already found, more mortality of orphans in institutions, because those are hotspots of infections. More institutionalized children are going to come about due to poverty of the families and the loss of allo parents, especially grandparents who have a lot of care to contribute in many, many countries to children. And too rapid deinstitutionalization, because staff is going away from them because they are scared about infections, creates more street children and children in abusive family, potentially, if it's not monitored, this deinstitutionalization. So my conclusion is that in wartime, and I refer to our studies with Abraham Sagi, Schwartz, Haifa, community kibbutzim were deserted because of one of those wars in Israel, because parents wanted the children close by, also throughout the night. But also in pandemics, only the extended families are safe havens for young people, but also for older people. We know that nursing homes are really deadly almost for many, many inhabitants. So what is needed, finally, for a safe development? Lessons to be learned. First, social interactions are the motor of development, not food, but the innate bias to seek comfort with protective caregivers is essential. Maybe one of the issues in the current lockdowns all over the world. Second, continuity of caregiving arrangements is essential. Prevention of fragmented care and breaking of bonds. But the network of attachment relationships needed for children, but also for caregivers to fall back upon. Last, and that's what already the previous speaker, Swanepoel, argued, is safe development is not specifically secure attachment development. Bowlby argued that safe is from salvus, absence of injury, and secure is from secura, without a care. And you might almost not imagine the environments of evolutionary adaptedness without any care. There were a lot of hazardous environments, and maybe no single secure attachment strategy was and still is the best fit to a specific niche. A lot of normative issues pop up here, but it's food for thought. Yeah, I think Femi Juffer, Marjan Bakermans-Kranenburg, and the Lancet Group Commission for Institutionalization, Deinstitutionalization, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Marinus. Some really startling facts and findings in your presentation. I have, let me see now. I have at least 2 questions here in the question box. One from Jerry Rafferty, who asks, would those deviations in institutions possibly reflect the reason why they are in an institution? So I guess the question is about cause and effect here.
Yeah, I see. That's a very important issue in the literature on institutionalization, the pre-existing differences. It might be that especially children in the past, as well as in the present, went into institutions because of certain vulnerabilities. And so if you compare those children in their development to children being raised in families, they are disadvantaged already from the start. But note that there is one very important randomized controlled trial comparing children in care as usual, which is the institution, was in Romania the case, in Bucharest, and going into foster care, part of them randomly assigned to foster care. So pre-existing difference were non-existent, and nevertheless, the foster care influence was huge, really converging with all kinds of correlational studies and our meta-analytic outcomes. Developmental delays were rapidly recovering, not completely, but certainly to a large extent. So this is conversion between experimental research and correlational research that make me somewhat more sure that it's not pre-existing differences. But certainly nowadays, it might be that most of the children who are adopted from institutions are special needs children. That's the term that's being used. And that's a specific selection that might indeed require more attention of service providers, clinical psychologists and psychiatrists.
Thank you for that. There is a question from an anonymous attendee who asks a question relevant to the current pandemic situation. And their question is any research being done about the effects that social isolation, caregiver mask wearing are having on the development of babies and children?
My hunch would be, my hypothesis would be, certainly there's an effect. It's so strange for children not to see the mouth in verbal interactions of the caregiver. It's so strange to not really interact, for example, in nursing homes with your beloved grandchild or child. And I think research in attachment theory and even animal research, like the research that Harry Harlow did on rhesus monkeys, shows that contact comfort is absolutely critical for development and for feeling well and balanced. So I think there's really a lot of impact, but I don't know at this point in time of any valid studies done in this area and on this topic. But it's a very important one to ask ourselves: what kind of effects and side effects does it have?
And there's a question from Graham Kidd. Would you agree that the closing of government orphanages would save governments money, as postulated by the charity Hope and Homes for Children?
Yeah, I think that it's so strange that it seems like institutional care is a kind of a luxury because you have bricks and stones and you have all kinds of facilities and they look very expensive, but there are econometric kind of computations done on this, the expenses of foster care, for example, and supportive families to prevent children going into institutional care might be much lower. The expense might be much lower than the costs for institutional care. And that's not only because institutions are expensive, but also because in the long run, and that's what we saw in our series of meta-analyses and empirical research that we did in several different countries, the setbacks for cognitive development, social emotional development, for physical development, growth, physical growth, so enormous that the expenses will accumulate in the course of the development of these institutionalized children when they become adolescents and adults. So it might be looking like it's a better solution also from an expenses kind of perspective, but in the end, my bet would be that it's a way more expensive investment. It's the only problem is going from one system to another. So how are we creating a transition that is not going at the expense of the children involved already in an institutional setting, but still leaves enough resources for building up a support network in all those mixed countries that are having not the resources. So, and there's hope now. For example, the organization that was mentioned just a minute ago, many Christian and other organizations in the area of institutional care are now trying to reformulate their goals and aims and go for a different kind of subsidizing and support system in countries that need that type of support. So I'm hopeful and that's going to happen in the next couple of years. But we are living in a very dangerous epoch now because of the pandemic, because there's also the danger of too rapid transition to so-called family life, but mostly life on the streets for those children. So it's a little bit of a paradox, and I hope that the pandemic will soon be over and these children can be saved from that type of life.
Yes, thanks for that. Another question from Anonymous, who asks about whether there is a sensitive age when the impact of institutional care is particularly negative.
Yeah, it's difficult to establish a very specific window. There is some evidence, especially from the Bucharest study, but also from correlational studies, and studies that Didi did, longitudinal studies that we did, starting very early, that before the age of 2, transition to family life leaves the fewest scars, so to say. And after 2, it's going to be more and more difficult to recover. But I'm really optimistic if the environment is changing, and that's because I did a lot of genetic research, makes clear how important the environment is. If the change of the environment is drastically enough, and that's the change from institution to family life, for example, then children really show their flexibility, their adaptational resources, their resilience, and they recover in 3-4 years. Maybe not in all areas, same speed, maybe some kind of problems remain in the long term, but an amazing catch-up growth is going to be seen if they make this transition. So I hope that it's true for children of all ages, not only for those who have been in a orphanage up until the year of 2 years after birth. And I think there's sufficient evidence for that.
Last question is from Denique Hubling, who asks, I think the question is about people with mental disorder, but that's my understanding, but it says, should placement with family be used instead of admission to a psychiatric hospital, at least for some patients? I think this is about mental disorder in general.
That's that's a question that I can't answer.
No.
What I feel is that institutional care is really bad for children. They need parents and other caregivers that devote some of their special time to learn the language of the child and get some singing in the interactions. So I think for children it's almost always bad, but similar to children needing sometimes when they are physically very ill in hospital, it might be that children who are mentally in great problems, it might be that they need a hospital kind of institutionalized setting, but as Bowlby very effectively organized by Robertson's films, etc., rooming in is something that we now feel is absolutely rule instead of exception for physical illnesses. Why not for mental illnesses in case of children involved? I would say, and that's similar to what Bowlby always argued, family type of treatment is, I think, to be preferred, and maybe in an institutional setting, but the two or the three together and not the child separated from the parents or the other way around. That would be my reasoning on the basis of all kinds of evidence, but I don't want to talk about adults with mental disorders because that's really too difficult for me. I'm not an expert in that field. And it's anyway a very tricky issue because if that kind of institution is going to be abolished, where do they stay in the end? We see a lot of street and rough sleepers, they call it in the UK, maybe as a consequence of that. So I'm a little bit wary about going to that direction.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your talk. And I'd like to thank both our speakers for the first session, Annie Swanepoel and Marinus van IJzendoorn.